So let's keep all that information in mind, Miss Ruby, as we turn back to how your ancestor fits into all of this. President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, which had declared freed slaves free in the Deep South, but not in Kentucky. But then America opened the door to freedom for African American men in Kentucky, like Alexander Beaumont. In early 1863, with battlefield losses rising, the War Department allowed the recruitment of slaves and free black men and promised freedom for those who enlisted. Camp Nelson became Kentucky's largest recruiting ground for black soldiers and eventually one of the largest in the nation. After the Dred Scott decision, no state was a safe refuge for escaped slaves who could guarantee their freedom only if they crossed the border into Canada. One slave who was freed at Camp Nelson when he joined the Army repeatedly said, "See how much better off we was now than we were 4 years ago? It used to be 500 miles to get to Canada from Lexington, but now it's only 18 miles. Camp Nelson is our Canada." Many Kentuckians were concerned about the idea of arming slaves, as you can imagine, whether or not they were in the Army. Union General Jeremiah Boyle, the commander of the Department of Kentucky, warned President Lincoln that the recruitment of slaves would, quote, revolutionize the state and do infinite and inconceivable harm. Ordinary citizens, even those who profess loyalty to the Union, were just as vocal in their complaints. Nevertheless, the enlistment of African Americans began in February 1864. Loyal slave owners were to receive $300 for each slave who volunteered for the Army, and fugitive slaves were also pressed into the service. The countryside near Camp Nelson was home to thousands of slaves. Just across the Kentucky River, Garrett County was home to 3,500 enslaved African Americans, more than a third of the county's total population. 325 of them would enlist at Camp Nelson, and one of them, Miss Ruby, was Alexander Beaumont. The journey could be perilous. When a group of 250 enslaved men left Danville in May 1864 to march to Camp Nelson, local residents threw stones and shot pistols at the recruits, who ultimately reached the camp safely. Meanwhile, Alexander Beaumont's home in Garrett County was less than 20 miles away. He likely faced danger on his own journey to the camp. But he made it. The photo on the screen was taken from the Garrett County side of the bridge where Alexander lived. On June 3rd, 1864, Alexander Beaumont, aged 25, crossed the bridge and joined Company E of the 116th Regiment of the United States Colored Infantry. According to his military service records, Beaumont served as a company cook for much of his duty. Now, Ruby, what do you think about how determined your ancestor was to join the Army?
He was really determined to make that trip across that bridge, because he had even been killed, or stoned or anything, and come up missing, and nobody knew what happened to him.
Yeah, so lots of courage that Alexander displayed.
He had a lot.
Yeah, he was definitely a very brave man. And he was also part of an important story in American history. In all, there were 175 regiments designated as United States colored troops, some 178,000 men. Their commissioned officers were all white, and opportunities for promotion were limited for African American soldiers. During the course of the war, they sustained more than their share of casualties, but fought with distinction. 15 were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration attainable by a member of the armed forces. Although the 116th USCT, as it was called, was organized in central Kentucky, the regiment did not serve in the Bluegrass State. Instead, military authorities sent these slave-turned soldiers to Virginia, near the Confederate capital of Richmond, to battle the seasoned veterans of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. In late 1864, the 116th USCT arrived in Virginia and took part in the Siege of Petersburg, a harrowing experience for many of the new African-American recruits. Beaumont's regiment went on to endure much carnage and casualties at Petersburg, where they were part of the largest African-American fighting force assembled during the war. After Petersburg finally fell to a Union army under General Ulysses S. Grant, the regiment joined the Union advance on Richmond. They fought at Hatcher's Run and during the Appomattox campaign, which ultimately led to the surrender of Robert E. Lee's army on April 9, 1865. Throughout this final campaign of the Civil War, the Confederate forces, weakened by casualties, disease, and desertions, were routinely outnumbered by Union troops. The Union advantage was due in part to soldiers like Alexander Beaumont. By the end of the war, the United States colored troops made up fully 10% of the Army's total strength. Of all the African Americans enlisted in the Army, full 20%, some 36,000 men, died during the war, a mortality rate that was 1/3 higher than white soldiers. But Alexander Beaumont survived. After the Civil War, authorities sent his regiment to Texas, where it served along the Rio Grande River. On January 17, 1867, the 116th USCT was mustered out of the service at Louisville. Beaumont, who remained with the regiment throughout his period, also left the Federal Army in January of 1867. So Ruby, what's your reaction to all this you've learned so far?
Oh, it's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable, isn't it?
It's just unbelievable.
Unfortunately, records that pertain to the early lives of Kentucky slaves, you know, they're scarce. Some military records give no indication of his status. In fact, one note on his enlistment record reads, "Status of this man, whether free or slave, when enlisted, not known."
Right.
Sounds familiar, right?
Yes.
So Ruby, tell us about the challenges that you faced in trying to find out the truth about your ancestor.
Oh, it's not as bad today as it was when I first started looking for him. I couldn't find hardly anything.
Right.
I even went to the museums in Louisville, and everything that I would go to, it would send me overseas.
Interesting.
And the Cresses and the Beaumont's family. And then by accident, I happened to go to Camp Nelson with a group, and there was a man there. He was in one of the films that he knew of Alex Beaumont. And he gave me some information. And from there, I found quite a bit about him.
Right.
Only thing that I haven't found is when he died. I haven't found out the date that he died.
Right. Well, there's more to this story.
Oh.
More to come.